El taller se inició en 1937.
The taller began in 1937. It was started by Leopoldo Méndez, Luis Arenal, Alfredo Salce, José Chávez Morado, and Siqueiros too. Anyhow, it was started by a bunch of people, and quickly they began to create an important body of work because the artists were tied to the unions, to the peasant groups, and their work was very varied and very intense.
The TGP was born in a time of great effervescence, of great change in Mexico. On the other hand, those who formed it were fighters who'd been active in the social movement. Many young people joined, many young people participated. But it's part of the change and of the thrust that was given to cultural work during that time. Not only in graphic arts, but also in music and film. It's a time in when the arts were blooming in this country, as well as the social and political changes that were taking place at that time.
We lived in the time following the revolution. We lived in a time of peace. But still, the impact of the Mexican Revolution was felt in the atmosphere. It was a Mexico that was nationalistic, a Mexico full of social and political protest. And that was precisely what motivated the lives of the artists. As a young artist, I would walk from my school to my house, and I'd find before me Diego Rivera painting in the Palacio Nacional. It was profoundly emotional, in full view of the public, in the patios of the Palacio Nacional. I'd walk a bit further, and I'd find José Clemente Orozco in the Iglesia de Jesús, developing a concept that was mystical, deep, but totally relevant to the time, to that moment in which we were living in Mexico. So all that was what was shaping me and filling me with social and artistic interest. That moment couldn't have been better in the life of Mexico.
Refugees began arriving in Mexico from all parts of the world. The bulk of the Great Migration was of Spanish Republicans, which is without a doubt the most important migratory phenomenon of the 20th century. But afterwards, those who arrived in Mexico were persecuted Austrians, Hungarians, Germans. Well, people arrived who in some cases already had well-established cultural, political, scientific, and professional lives. Doctors arrived, philosophers arrived, and all types of people arrived.
It was a time when people were interested in social art and not just expressing themselves, but doing something like the mural paintings and so forth. And they were very interested in what was going on in Mexico. So they came, and some visited the taller. Because I was an Afro-American living here, they were always knocking at my door.
There was freedom of the press. There was also very, very strong criticism that, well, was part of the democratic change that was developing during that time. The possibility that everyone could express themselves, organize themselves, participate to say what they believe, be it in favor of or against the government.
We worked collectively, as you probably know, and we would bring in the work that we were working on and discuss it and have criticism.
Estábamos muy preocupados por todo lo
We were very concerned about everything that was going on in the neighborhoods of Mexico City.
Salíamos a los alrededores del Distrito Federal a
We went
dibujar,
all around the city to draw,
y luego los
and then on
días
Fridays,
viernes, que eran las
when the
reuniones
taller
del
met,
taller,
we would discuss what we had
platicábamos
seen,
sobre lo que habíamos visto, sobre lo
what
que
interested
nos
us.
interesaba. A veces coincidíamos
Sometimes
en
we would
trabajos
collaborate in
colectivos,
collective
y allí
works, and in these
no había
cases,
propiamente
we didn't really have
decisiones
anyone
de lo que
telling us
deberíamos
what we
hacer,
needed to do,
sino opiniones
but we were
de
guided by
varios
the opinions of our
compañeros.
colleagues.
Cada quien, si una persona estaba
If an artist was
era
responsible to
responsable de
create a
realizar
piece
un
of work,
trabajo, sopesaba
then that
las
artist,
opiniones
after
y
considering
corregía
these
o no
opinions,
corregía su punto
may
de
or may
vista.
not amend that
Además
point
que
of
era
view.
muy democrático.
So that discussion was very democratic.
Ese sistema de
That system of presenting our projects, of listening to others' opinions, weren't harsh as you might imagine. On the contrary, they were deeply stimulating.
It was a positive criticism. For instance, somebody would say, "Why have you hidden the hands on that man?" And the artist said, "Well, I can't do hands." So they said, "Well, I'll do the hands." It didn't matter who worked, people worked together on prints. It didn't matter, the idea was to do the best art possible, use the best symbolism possible, and not who had done the work. A lot of it was not signed even. They just put in TGP.
El taller de gráfica popular no era
The Taller de Gráfica Popular wasn't an organization made up of only one party. In reality, there were different currents. There were different influences. Those of us who were in the Communist Party and those of us who were in the Popular Party. We had our differences, which were discussed quite pleasantly sometimes, and other times they were very heated discussions.
Yo, aún estando en la periferia, digamos, estando
Even as someone who was on the periphery, I was attentive and knew what was going on there.
y sabía y me gustaba
I soaked it all up.
dentro de lo que era precisamente
I liked always being in the midst of the development of their ideas.
sus posiciones, porque no eran solamente
They weren't merely being creative.
únicamente interpretativas.
Their creations were the product of discussions about how to best represent their ideas through graphic art
Y ver cómo podían ser más útiles en su expresión gráfica para
for a
un
message
mensaje
against war,
contra la guerra,
for a message against totalitarianism,
contra un mensaje contra las bombas,
a message against bombs,
un mensaje para evitar las muertes,
a message to end killing and massacres,
buscar cómo luchar,
to search for how to fight
había luchado
and how they fought in the past in Mexico.
por eso interpretaron
That's why they depicted the Mexican Revolution in a lot of their work.
No podíamos haber
We
expresado
couldn't
otra
have
cosa
expressed
que nuestra
anything more
protesta
than our passionate protest at that time.
apasionada de ese momento.
Nosotros como artistas.
We, as artists, were very involved in all the politics and life in Mexico.
The use of the graphic material was very important. So they would do, for example, they did this before I came. They illustrated a series of books in the different Indian languages so people could learn to read and write in their own language, and then to learn to read and write in Spanish.
Lithography reached its highest form of expression when it was behind an ideology, when an ideology propelled it.
Aquí podemos ver nada menos que lo
Here we
que
can
fue
see no less than what
el
precisely motivated the members of the TGP so much:
análisis de la revolución.
the analysis of the Mexican Revolution.
Este tipo de trato,
This type of treatment,
los peones acaso
how the peons on a hacienda were
cómo eran
punished.
castigados. Esto nos representa
This
una
represents the
síntesis de algo
synthesis
que nos
of
dice
something that tells
mucho
us a lot
lo que él
about what the artist
pensaba
thought
en el arte y lo que
and what the
el
TGP
taller
devoted
fue
itself to.
también penetrando.
They were sent to work all across the country. For example, Beltran and Mexiac were in the Chamula region. Beltran made illustrations there for a book called Juan Pérez Jolote, about the life of a Chamula person.
Fui de los primeros que empezamos a ayudar a los
I was among the first in our group to help indigenous people no longer fear those who had exploited them, the mestizos.
Era verdaderamente doloroso.
What we witnessed during that time was truly painful.
Entonces, a través de muchos años, esos grupos indígenas, poco a
And so
poco,
after many
fueron
years,
adquiriendo conciencia.
those indigenous groups, little by little, began to gain social consciousness.
Cuando hubo el levantamiento indígena,
That's why in 1984,
habíamos trabajado
when there was the indigenous
realmente
uprising,
sentimos
many of us who had worked over there
fue-
really felt that our labor had positive effects
tenían conciencia
because those people now had an awareness of who they were.
que se ha
In Mexico, it's very common to talk about indigenous rights, but they're still discriminated against.
yo siempre
That's why I will always support giving indigenous people their rightful place within society, and I've always been for that.
Mexiac made a print where a person's mouth is bound with a lock and chain. He made it in 1954 to challenge and criticize the politics of a North American named McCarthy, who led the persecution of communists. So the lithograph was made against that type of behavior. And afterwards, it was adopted by the student movement of 1968. Also, another lithograph, one by Garcia Bustos, depicts a soldier on horseback who has a demonstrator pinned down on the ground.
Los grupos conservadores que
The conservative groups who were in the government, in the regime, organized periods of repression that were very dramatic, like the famous 2nd of October, which was a bloodbath for the Mexican people that can never be forgotten.
que no se puede olvidar.
El taller, manteniéndose en esa posición,
The TGP wanted, above all, for its message to be accessible to the worker, that it could reach the peasant.
que llegue al campesino.
We had a direct relationship with people in Mexico, rural people and urban people. And they knew that they could get work from the taller. We would have to raise money sometimes to do the printing. It was a wonderful organization.
Muchos de los miembros del taller habían sido.
Many members of the TGP participated in what in those days was called the cultural brigades. These were mainly brigades of teachers, teachers of different disciplines who went out to the rural communities to promote the development of those communities, to educate the people.
We helped with literacy. They had literacy programs. We helped with that. We helped with building schools. We helped with the corn production. We helped with peasants getting the prevailing price for beans or for corn and not giving them to middlemen at a lower price. Things like that. We worked with the government, but they didn't pay us.
Mi acercamiento al taller fue porque
The way that I
ayudé
became
a
involved
Ignacio
with the
Aguirre
TGP was by helping Ignacio Aguirre and Pablo O'Higgins on a mural that they were creating in Tarasquillo in the state of Mexico.
pues vieron que yo era un chico
Well,
entusiasta
they saw that I was an enthusiastic kid and they invited me to join the
Ya
taller.
en el taller empecé a ver que
Once
había
there,
piedras
I saw that they had lithographic stones,
mis dibujos ahí.
that I could do my drawings there.
Una persona que
There was a person there who had an extraordinary ability to make prints, Jose Sanchez,
además le faltaba
who in
un
fact
brazo y
was missing an arm.
sacaba.
He was the one who would press our copies for us.
Trabajar.
So I started to work making lithographs in the taller.
Allí empecé a
That's where I grabbed the first tools, and on small pieces of linoleum that some of my colleagues would give me, I started to create little works,
trabajitos.
which in fact, Mariana Jampolsky, who was in charge of organizing the exhibitions, would place next to the others' work.
Ponía allí junto con los demás.
En el caso de Mariana, ella provenía un
In the
padre
case of
ruso,
Mariana, she had a Russian father who was a sculptor
una madre
and a German mother who both lived in the United States.
en Estados Unidos.
As a young person, Mariana began to feel dissatisfied with her university studies in the United States, in Illinois, where she was born. She heard about the TGP and that it was doing work for disenfranchised people, which could transcend what she had been doing with her artistic expression.
Los artistas de esa época tuvieron mucho que ver.
The artists of that time had a big influence in the development of different branches of art all over the world.
Llegaban al taller de gráfica popular.
Diverse groups of people came to the TGP from the United States, Latin America,
de Latinoamérica,
Europe.
Europa. Entre las gentes que yo
Among the
recuerdo
people I
cuando
remember
recién ingresé
from when I had just joined the taller was Moshe Gat,
que sé que es un
who I know is an important artist in Israel.
I was an artist in New York City. I applied for a Rosenwald grant. At that time, it was the only grant that black artists could get. And my project was to do a series of prints, paintings, and sculpture on black women, because they had only been represented either as servants or exotic people in art. And I thought it was time to show them as the hardworking and heroic people that they are. One of the members of the jury told me, "You should get out of New York City." So the natural place for me to come, and it wasn't a big grant, so I came to Mexico.
Nosotros escogimos Oaxaca para
We chose Oaxaca to develop our work.
desarrollar nuestro trabajo. Sábados y domingos visitábamos
Saturdays and Sundays, we would visit markets close to the city.
cercanos a la ciudad. Uno de ellos, de los poblados más
One of the most interesting towns we saw was Tlacolula.
Entonces, todos los domingos
So
llevaba yo,
every Sunday,
siempre acostumbro,
I would bring my notepad, as I always do,
donde
to make
anoto,
notes and observations.
hago mis anotaciones, mis observaciones.
Upon
Y
returning, I had
regresando,
recognized that
había
the
yo
bread
ya
market
conseguido que
was
ese
very
mercado
beautiful,
de pan era muy hermoso,
and that it
había
had to be
que
highlighted.
señalarlo por su
Because of its primitive way, because of the indigenous groups who took care of the place, all that fascinated
Todo
us.
eso nos fascinaba. En el año 54,
In 1954,
el crítico de arte,
the distinguished art critic Luis Cardosa y Aragon
me invitó
invited me to come to Guatemala,
a Guatemala, que es
which is
la
the
tierra
land where Rina was
que
born,
había nacido Rina,
and where an
y
important
estaba
revolutionary
realizando
experience was
una
developing.
importante experiencia de revolución.
Se habían dado cuenta, no
They
solo
noticed not just the cultural types, but also the politicians,
de que
that lithography has a direct connection with an illiterate population, like the one that was in Guatemala, and they created lithographic works in the style of the Taller de Gráfica Popular, who, in earlier times, had really provided Mexico with posters for the unions, for all the political movements that were in this country.
Yo hice una colección
I
de
produced a
11
collection of 11 lithographs
desarrollo de los
about the development of what I could observe during that time, and I called it Testimonio de Guatemala. The lithograph, Corazón de América, is part of that collection. It's the beautiful and bucolic landscape of Guatemala, which is being run over by a weapon.
atropellado por una arma.
La oración indígena, yo la realicé en San Cristóbal Las Casas.
I created La Oración Indígena in San Cristóbal de las Casas, Chiapas. It is a scene from daily life in the church of Chamula. The indigenous people go there to pray, to light candles, to drink alcohol in the temple. That's what they do as part of their ritual. And it's very common to see that happening, even today. They bring incense. The place is magical. The temple has an aroma of pine needles, which have been crushed by the indigenous people as they walk on them. because the pine needles are spread out on the floor like a carpet. So in Chiapas, I created many lithographs like that one, La Oración Indígena, because I lived there for 3 years in San Cristóbal de las Casas.
It was a combative group of people, a group of people who fought to make their country better and bring about a better quality of life.
We participated in the festivities of the 15th of September, where the statue of Miguel Alemán was painted. They painted it as a protest. And so the authorities caught wind of all this. And when they decided to take over the university, they went looking for people who stood out, who were involved in the movement. They came looking for me here in this house. At midnight, 5 policemen arrived dressed up as students. They rang the doorbell. I thought they were my nephews who were students. I opened the door, and they came in, and they were looking for both of us, but they only found me. And they took me to jail that very night. They kept looking for Arturo. But since he was at the Taller de Gráfica Popular at that time, with José Sanchez, making some posters to be used for that movement, he wasn't home, even though it was midnight. And at midnight, the police left, and they didn't take him, thank goodness, only me. And with how terrible something like that can be, it was actually a very interesting experience, because I was able to get to know the movement from the inside, as a political movement, which for an artist provides motivation that needs to be expressed. That is why I have lithographs that I made in that moment. In fact, I drew them right there in the women's prison. All the women who were there, how interesting all their stories were. While I was in there, I got to hear terrible tales from each one of the women prisoners, who would tell us about their lives.
I was harassed by the United States Embassy. They called me in to see about citizenship and asked me and told me that I had to make out a list of all the communists I knew. If I didn't do it, I couldn't get any help from the embassy for anything. They would regard me as a non-citizen. And I didn't do it, and I didn't hear anything from them for some time. And then I was arrested one night when there was a strike of the railroad workers. Somebody knocked at the door. We lived on the 3rd floor. When I went to the door, there was a dark man smelling like tequila. And I thought it was a tourist. But he said, "We're from Gobernación, and we want to see your papers." My oldest son was standing by me with some red pajamas, and all of a sudden he said, "You're coming with us," and he grabbed my arm and twisted me around and put his hand under my throat, arm under my throat, and marched me out into the hall where there were 3 other men, and 2 of them took me by the arms and lifted me up off the floor. I had on some bedroom slippers and a sweater, luckily. And the other one was behind. He was knocking down my oldest son who was trying to stop them. He was about, 10. And they just carried me down and out and put me in a car between 2 of them, and we drove around the city, and they threatened me. Finally, they pulled up at a house, and they, with my hands behind me, they took me in and sat me down and took out a list of names on some very nice paper and signed and checked me off. I was the 3rd one. And they evidently were arresting the whole list because they said they were all Americans, and many of them I knew, whose names I knew, were refugees here from the McCarthy movement. Like Dalton Trumbo and Albert Maltz, people that worked in Hollywood. A lot of them were. I was in there Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday, and some people came by and brought me things. my little boy called Pablo O'Higgins, and he went out to where my husband was singing and playing the guitar. At this party that broke up, everybody went out to see who could get me out of the jug. I was in with 2 Cuban women and a German woman. The 2 Cubans, one was telling the other one's fortune. And I said, tell mine. So she said, well, you crossed my palm with silver. So I gave her a 50-cent piece. She said, make a wish. You know what I wished? To get out of there. So, because I didn't know whether they were going to deport me. I hadn't heard anything from anybody except some people that left me some drawing material and some cigarettes. I was smoking then. So she said, you're going to get your wish. And just then somebody beat on the door. And the guard said, Señora Elizabeth, sale con todos sus chivas. Come out with all your junk.
En el caso de los ferrocarrileros y presos políticos.
In the case of the railroad workers and political prisoners, we should remember that one of them belonged to the TGP, David Alfaro Siqueiros. That is to say, when there was a time of strong repression in my country, my father very insistently argued before the governments, specifically of López Mateos and of Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, so that the political prisoners be liberated. It was one of the moments which put him at odds politically with those governments, his insistence that freedom be given to those who were made prisoners for political reasons. But returning to the TGP and its people, they were without a doubt important activists in support of the movement of '68, of the students, and in general to the resurgence of the popular movements in the country.